played Dota 2 for thousands of hours, but you've always wanted something more. A reason to fight, a deeper meaning to your battles. But to know the hidden history of Dota 2, you must go on an adventure of a lifetime. An adventure into the lore!
In defense of the Ancients are obviously the focus of the game world. They are powerful, wise, omnipresent, sure, but they're not the only ones. In fact, the Dota 2 universe has plenty of powerful beings that can shape lands, time, and even fate. Yes, the world of Dota 2 is one where gods are real and influence the world with their powers. And that's going to be our focus today, exploring some of these powerful gods and showing the lore behind who they are and what they control. Now let's get this out of the way here first. We will not be covering all the gods mentioned in Dota 2 because that list is basically endless. First, you have gods that only been mentioned in names, such as the Goddess of Luck, who pities ogre magi, the Boar God, who Juggernaut respects, the War God of 1,000 Tarns, who Axe defeated. This list goes on and on and on, and while some of them have pretty cool stories, like how the Solar Goddess is worshipped by the people of the Waste where Sand King comes from, whose followers are experts at using gold and craftsmanship, making outfits for both Alina and Bounty Hunter, there's simply not much information on all these gods, if they're even gods at all. I mean, in the Dota 2 universe, what exactly makes a god? In a world where magic is prevalent and beings exist with such power that they can destroy cosmic entities themselves just by gaining enough experience, what exactly separates a powerful wizard from a god anyway? Take Zeus, for example. He claims that he is a god, he has a backstory of a god, but what makes his powers any different from, say, Disruptor, Lina, or even Crystal Maiden? For all we know, Zeus is a powerful storm mage whose complete narcissism, fueled by a Napoleon complex, drove him into madness as he convinced the world that he was a god of Greek lore, which makes more sense to me than the Greek pantheon existing in the Dota 2 universe, despite Greece not even existing there. And don't get me started on demigods, people who have been given godly power or were born from gods, because that's pretty much 90% of the Dota 2 heroes, and ain't nobody got time. But as you can see, gods seem to be more of a title than a classification in Dota 2. We have covered before that an act of leveling up is basically ascending into godhood, and all one needs to do to level up is experience the world around them. Thus, becoming a god is sort of the end result if you live long enough, if you are strong enough to survive. That would explain why there are so many gods in Dota 2, as really, it's not that hard. If you just survive and live long enough and gain enough experience, eventually you'll get there. So with that out of the way, let's get into some of my favorite gods in this episode. And if we're gonna start with favorites, well then of course I need to begin with my personal favorite hero of all time, the Omni Knight. Omni Knight's tale is a grim one. In short, he was a loyal and religious man who crusaded around the world in the name of his god, the Omniscience, staying loyal and faithful and assuring himself that all the atrocities he committed in the name of faith were for a higher cause. He fought for decades, but time pushed on and the burden of lost friends and brutal fighting began to weigh on him heavily. After some time, he was sick of seeing his friends and mentors buried in sorry, wet graves at the side of muddy roads for a god who had never even shown himself. So he went back home to challenge the priests of his faith and demand proof that there was a god at all. And surprisingly, well, he did. For weeks, he followed them down caverns to the center of the planet itself, and in its core was the actual Omniscience, who spoke to him and revealed that it had created the world around itself to protect it from the horrors of space. Omni Knight was satisfied with this answer and went back to the faith with more vigor and power than ever. Pretty happy ending. Or is it? The lore is pretty strange in that it mentions the following. Perhaps the Omniscience is a liar, deep in its prison of stone, and not the world's creator at all, but the Omni Knight never again questioned his fate. It always struck me as odd that this would ever be mentioned. Why put in doubt into a pretty open and shut story? And that's where the headcanon begins. Is the Omniscience a true god? Many heroes actually doubt it. Monkey King, who has done battles with plenty of gods before, claims to not even have ever heard of the Omniscience.
Your powers may be real, but I've never seen this omniscience.
corrupt, and many powerful beings such as Chaos Knight mock Omni Knight for his blind faith.
Where is your omniscient one now?
Blind in that he will follow anything he believes in, or blind because the thing that he believes in isn't real at all? Let's take a look at Omni Knight himself. As we've already covered, in Dota 2, experience can give you power, and no one is more experienced than a healer who for his entire life has known only war through countless battles and crusades. Perhaps it was not the Omniscience who gave the power to Omni Knight, but the Knight's power itself, growing in level and experience after every battle he somehow survived over a lifetime of war. He did, after all, glow with the light and power before he even met the Omniscience as stated in his lore. So we can assume that the reason he had lasted so long in his countless battles over comrades was due to his own innate power, which grew over time. So if the Omniscience isn't a god granting its followers power, then what exactly is it? Well, we've heard a similar story before, haven't we? A consciousness which seems to be all-seeing and all-knowing, trapped within a prison of rock? Yep, the Ancients. Remember how Dire and Radiant were two parts of the self? Perhaps this is just another part of the self who was trapped in a celestial body by the Arc Warden. But since it's alone, it never gained enough energy to escape, staying trapped forever in its stone solitary prison. If that's the case, hell, maybe every planet in the Dota 2 universe has a piece of the self as its molten core. That, or it's something else entirely. Now, if you bought into my theory of the third ancient way back in our first episode of Loregasm, perhaps the Omniscience is the third ancient. A growing power under the earth responsible for the nether reaches and the magic and intelligent powers of its denizens. The best part is, even if the Omniscience is the third ancient, an evil force growing an army from below and above, masquerading as a god, waging a war on two fronts of good and evil, much like the Radiant and the Dire, Omni Knight doesn't even care. Omni Knight has no concern if his god is a good one or an evil one, just that it exists. For all we know, the holy and pure Omni Knight could actually be an apostle of death and chaos, his holy light casting a brutal and terrible shadow. But that's just the headcanon, so that's up for you and I to decide. And that headcanon is now over. The Omniscience isn't the only holy god out there on the surface, gathering loyal followers. Obelis, the god Chen worships, has many similarities. The Knights of the Fold also crusaded around the lands, destroying heretics who did not share their faith, and forced those like Chen, who were defeated by their armies, to convert or die. Chen converted and became one of their most devout, using his tribal heritage of animal husbandry magic to convert even more to the fold, building their ranks and maintaining their health. But what do we know about Obelis? Chen refers to him as the one god, so inherently he believes that he's the only real god in the Dota 2 realm. While we don't know much else about Obelis, we do see some of the effects of Obelis in the game world. The name Obelis is very similar to the real world obelisk, which are stone pillars erected as monuments or even places of holy worship. We have similar stone pillars in Dota 2, but we like to call them towers. Interestingly enough, the towers do appear to be closely tied to obelisks. Take, for example, their appearance. On the top of the Radiant Tower, it looks nearly identical to the holy headdress Chen wears into battle, which I would imagine all the Knights of the Fold would wear, considering Chen is extremely devout and a leader to the others in the Fold. Not only do the towers match the religious garments of the Knights of the Fold, but they also have very basic and volatile attacks, much like Chen's Test of Faith. The fact that they do not attack those who are your allies or enthralled to the same leader also makes sense as to why they would be tools of Obelis, who would want a way to defend conquered lands that would allow those he has enslaved to pass through unharmed. Alright, you might be asking, why would these towers be present on the Dota 2 map, and what's up with the Dire towers? Well, looking at them physically, we can see the Radiant Tower is wrapped in an aggressive plant vines, plant life, which is commonly associated with the Radiant. Dire towers seem to be degraded but covered in black dire stone and lava, telltale signs of dire corruption. This leads us to conclude that the towers have been converted by the Ancients themselves, built and attached to the land by the followers of Obelis, but then converted when Radiant and Dire influence spread throughout that earth. These towers were built by the followers of Obelis, most likely appearing like the Radiant Tower, until they were converted by the Ancients for their impressive abilities to only attack enemies to those who were enthralled by them. For two entities that can only battle each other by mind controlling warriors, towers are a super useful essential commodity for the ancients. While we may not know much about Obelis himself, the structures his followers erected in the past are essential parts of our current daily battles. Do I have anything else for Obelis? Well, hit that headcanon alert. There's a good chance that Chen's god and Omniknight's god may be one and the same. After all, Chen's powers are merely an extension of powers he already had before his conversion, his main power being the ability to magically enthrall animals. This explains Holy Persuasion and Penitence, as both are just uses of powers that he was born with. Test of Faith reads that Knights of the Fold possess fanatical forms of magic, which is considered unwieldy. So it's assumed that the spells he learned are simply passed down by Knights of the Fold, and aren't very refined at all. That leaves Chen's ult, Hand of God, which again seems to just be an extension of what he was already capable of, using mental links with his thralls to heal them. So in the end, much like Omniknight, it appears Obelis doesn't really give much to its followers other than a cause to fight for. Not to mention the strange effects towers have. Let's think here for a sec. Towers are magically immune, much like a repelled unit. They cannot be healed unless through a magic immune way, and furthermore, they have an ability which allows them to become completely immune to physical damage. Guardian Angel, anyone? In fact, Guardian Angel is one of the only spells that can be cast on a tower, besides Bloodlust and Ice Armor, but the other two could be cast on anybody. It makes sense that one set of knights travels the land converting everyone that they find, while another travels the land specializing in healing the ranks and maintaining those around them, even those converted. The Omniscience does claim to have the power to manipulate stone as well, which would explain how the towers were formed by its followers in the first place. But that's all just headcanon, which again, ends here. Not all gods are holy in Dota 2, characterized by the bright light and healing prayer. Nope, some of the gods in the Dota 2 world are dark, violent, and thirsty. Take, for example, the Flayed Twins, who Bloodseeker serves. The Flayed Twins are twin gods who need a constant supply of blood, most likely because they are literally flayed, their skin missing from their bodies, exposing their bare muscle, and most likely letting the blood flow freely out of them. No one knows what the story is behind this, the flays being from themselves to amplify blood magics or done to them by an enemy, but one thing is known: they are extremely powerful. They are undefeatable, unmovable, and they must be fed. This is the job of the Bloodseeker. The story begins in a place called, oh god, TheKatHatter, an Aztec-like society in mist-covered mountains, who are protected but also threatened by the twins. The pact is simple. The people of provide the Flayed Twins blood, or the twins descend upon them and collect the blood they desire from their corpses. Due to this, the people provide routine blood sacrifices, but it's never enough, as the twins demand oceanic amounts of blood. To solve this, the people presented them with a weapon, a man who would go throughout the world with only one goal: to acquire blood for the blood gods. Bloodseeker's clothing and weapons are covered in special magical runes that transfer any blood that he touches directly to the twins, and his only job in life is to cover those weapons and clothes in as much blood as possible to save his people. But enough about him, let's talk about the interesting things the twins can do. For one, they have the power to physically transform their followers. You can see that Bloodseeker is humanoid, but if you look closely enough, you can tell that he has a lot of dog-like features, alluding that the twins transformed him into a bloodhound-like creature to find fresh blood quicker. Not only do they transform their host, but they also have the power to possess their followers, giving them sight beyond sight, allowing them to see creatures that are bleeding, low-health targets. While many believe that this is literal, having the twins take over the follower and giving them sight, I think it's more metaphorical. Bloodseeker wears a hood to cover his eyes and ears, leading me to believe that he mutes these other senses to heighten the smell and taste, two most used by animal hunters like bloodhounds. It's interesting to note that the Bloodseeker is just as much a victim as his prey. I mean, overall, he's not a bad guy. If he doesn't kill, his entire people will be wiped out by vengeful and cruel gods who are undefeatable. However, that doesn't mean that he hasn't grown to enjoy his bloody mission over time, as you can readily tell. Another god that's not the nicest, but does have a loyal following, is Scree'auk, god of vengeance and the one who gave Vengeful Spirit her power. The Skywrath are a pretty strange race. They seem to be alright, but just like real-world birds, what appears to be nice and cute more often than not turns out to be a bunch of assholes. Yes, birds are dicks. Anyway, Skywrath have two known gods: Olivia, who seems to be the nice one, although she's mostly known for having bloody pinions, aka Outermost Feathers, so that's less nice than more wrath, I would suppose. Now, if praying to a war bird god is a little tame for you, then you can pray to Scree'auk if you have been wronged. Originally a princess next in line for the throne, Vengeful Spirit's sister attempted to assassinate her by trapping her in a net and letting her fall to her death from the ghastly Eyrie. Venge survived this by cutting off her wings, meaning she could never fly home and would never again be accepted if she even could. Obsessed with vengeance, she approached Scree'auk to gain power, only to find that she would need to give up her earthly body and transform into a spirit to do so. She accepted, and the rest is history. It's interesting to know here, by the way, that an auk is a category of birds, but a special kind. Flightless birds. This leads us to believe that she is perhaps a god of the downtrodden, a god reserved for only those who have been crippled and shamed in Skyrath's society, much like itself. Perhaps Scree'auk took pity on the vengeful spirit because she too had lost her ability to fly from a deceitful sister. That would explain the bloody pinions, after all, but no matter her story, we know that Scree'auk has the power to take life and turn it into a spirit, giving the gift of power to the powerless. One mystery still perplexes me with this god, and that is if there is any connection to, above all people, Juggernaut. In Juggernaut's lore, we learn that his homeland vanished beneath the waves in a night of vengeful magic. Of course, the Scream Scree'auk, or at least the followers of her, but why the Isle of Masks? Japan has a variety of flightless birds. Did the people of the Isle of Masks hunt the birds to extinction like the dodo? Did the island threaten the ghastly Eyrie in some way? We don't have any answers to this, but the use of vengeful magic is so strange here. I figured that it had to be mentioned. Maybe one day we'll know. Blood, vengeance, conversion, faith, all these gods seem to stick to one central theme. But what about the two biggest themes in our petty existence? Life and death. Well, let's get to our last two gods for this episode, starting with Verodicia, the goddess of the woods, but basically the goddess of nature and life. If you believe the Omniscience when it claimed that it built the rock of the planet around itself, then Verodicia was the god who put the plants and animals on its surface. She was responsible for a ton of things on Ru, the short list being putting the earth spirit in, well, the earth, growing all the plants, moving water from below the crust to the surface, enslaving the sun, pretty much everything that's good in nature. Her main method for growth were seeds, magical and powerful, that could grow to whatever she desired. After populating the barren lands with lush green, she realized that the process had drained her, and she would soon die herself. Afraid of what could happen to life without her watching over it, she created a few clever failsafes. First, the tree of protectors, who would guard nature and the woods, but they must have proven a bit too passive or slow to defend overall. She came up with a backup plan if all else failed, a special seed that would restart the process of populating the planet should all fall to chaos, and entrusted it to the Bear Clan. Lone Druid carries that seed now, the last member of the Bear Clan, whose only job is to survive the end of the world to plant that very seed, should that end ever come. But while the trans were semi-successful and the backup plan sure was nice, Verodicia still needed a protector of all things nature. So in her last breath, she placed the final seed and planted it inside of herself, using only her body as the soil to which the nature's prophet sprung. It's a beautiful, interconnected story, much like nature itself, and the effects of Verodicia's sacrifice touch many heroes that call Ru home. So what about the other side of the coin? For every life there's death, and the dead god is the answer for Verodicia. Perhaps a necromancer whose mastery reached that of godhood, or perhaps death itself. The dead god spreads, well, death among the lands in the form of restless dead, who he raises to create more dead for his unyielding army. The army of the undead spread something called the Dirge, which is extremely interesting. Undying was originally a soldier who came face to face with the zombies from the dead god's army and was thrown into a pit, where he lived long enough to feast on the other men thrown down there, his allies. But within that pit, he contracted the dirge, described as a sound in his mind, faint at first but eventually deafening, which transformed him into the general of the dead god's army, which he currently is. This dirge seems to be the magic that the dead god possesses, which brings the dead to life and compels them to do his bidding. a magical song-like noise that only dead ears can hear. Undying has been leading the army of the dead ever since, ransacking places such as Antimage's mountaintop monastery, where the dead killed all of the peaceful monks there to Animage's horror, who was the sole survivor of the incident and who subsequently swore to destroy the dead god and all magic. That's the story we know, but there are several interesting things about the dead god that haven't really been discussed before. For one, why hasn't he won yet? Undying is extremely old, being transformed well before the ancients fell to the planet, even old enough to remember Invoker when his name was simply Carl. Yeah, I'm not joking about that.
Carl, is that you?
So the Legion of the Dead has been marauding and killing for a very, very long time. And as any zombie movie enthusiast would know, zombie attacks spread exponentially and fast. After all, every defeated enemy is an additional warrior for you. So why hasn't the dead god killed everything yet? Or at least driven the world into a post-apocalyptic nightmare? The only explanation would be that he doesn't want to. Unless the army of the dead is defeated time and time again, which according to Undying's lore, he is able to rise again after being slain, I can't really imagine that the dead god and his dirge would be defeated very easily. This begs the question, if the end goal isn't to consume all life, as is the normal zombie tale, then what could it be? Perhaps our only clue is that the dead god is said to be nihilistic. He believes that life is meaningless and rejects all religion and moral principles. Perhaps the dead god's goal isn't to kill all life like a typical zombie horde, but rather target those who find a higher meaning in life, those of faith who look beyond our limited existence. This would explain the attack on Animage's monastery, one of the only recorded attacks that we know of in the lore, where the dead gods sought to snuff out monks that were so obsessed with meditation that they would let themselves get slaughtered with no recourse. The Animage and Windranger comic Dark Purpose, which is, don't get me wrong, a complete piece of garbage lore-wise, does show us that the followers of the dead god are pretty much sentient, even fearing for their lives and rallying each other to fight and not be afraid. So in the end, perhaps the dead god isn't a stereotypical evil zombie horde leader, but instead a leader with a purpose. One that, when he completes, he returns his zombies to their graves rather than attempting to take over the planet. That purpose is culling the powerful. Headcanon time! Remember how at the beginning of this video I told you that basically anyone could become a god in Dota 2? With enough experience and power, your powers could rise more and more, and with each powerful enemy you defeated, your power could grow exponentially. The question then would be, well, where does that end? Why do those like Invoker, whose power reaches states where they become basically immortal, live in hiding? I believe because the dead god is the one who keeps the world in check. He believes that life is meaningless, and those that ascend to godhood would directly conflict with that notion, giving purpose to the followers who had faith in those now godlike beings. So it would reason then that the dead god's mission is that of a god killer, focusing first on the faithful and slaying them, then turning them against their gods, or at least giving the gods no more power. For what is a king without a kingdom? What is a ruler with no one to rule? As I stated before, you simply can't win against an undead army, especially if its general can be defeated and rise again anew. No, the only way to stop the cycle of growing in power and then losing it to the dead god's wrath would be to kill the god himself, the very mission of the Anti-Mage. But then who would keep Joe Schmo from rising to godhood? Who would keep everyone in the Dota 2 universe from eventually becoming an all-powerful being? The dead god is a necessity, a balance to those who have escaped death long enough to grow to godhood. So is the dead god really a bad guy? Or is his job more like a hunter who kills the overpopulated deer? Morals aren't my job, just the lore, so that's for you to decide. And that will just about do it for this episode. Wait. What about Salamene? Or Malron the Tentacular? Or Niktasha? Well, as I said, there's a lot of gods in the Dota 2 world, and we will be getting to them eventually. But for now, use that experience you have gained to grow yourself and follow your own path to lore godliness. Big thank you to Merrymind for the custom artwork in the Dota 2 Pantheon series. You can check out that here. Thanks again for watching. This episode's script was co-written and reviewed by the nice folks who gave to the Patreon to pay for my wonderful editor and artists. If you want to be part of that fun, go ahead and check out the Patreon there. Shout out to all the guys on the screen. And thanks again, and we will see you next time on Loregasm.